Welcome to FreeThinking Ministries, where we seek to help people reason together by applying logic and sound theology to all aspects of life. I'm Josh Klein, and Dr. Tim Stratton is with me today. Today, we break down Dr. William Lane Craig versus Alex O'Connor. But before we do that, make sure you like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel. This is an important discussion that we hope you partake in, and let people know what you think in the comments as well. So today, Tim, president and founder of FreeThinking Ministries, and myself, we're going to be joined by the president and founder of Sound Faith Consulting, Tyson James. Thanks for joining us today, Tyson.
Thanks for having me, guys.
It's awesome having you here, brother.
Yeah, obviously, some might say we're a little bit biased in this conversation, first of all. So let's just put all our cards on the table as we have a conversation, because Tyson works with Reasonable Faith. Tim has been a chapter director with Reasonable Faith, so nobody's denying that. So yes, we're a little bit biased. But bias aside, I think we're going to break some important aspects down of this conversation. What do you guys think?
Well, I think, number one, we have good reasons to be biased, or for our biases. They're not just blind biases, but we do understand that we have biases, and we think we have reasons for them. But at the same time, we're careful to try to bracket them as much as possible. And with that said, we know that everybody has biases, including Alex O'Connor and anybody else who would be watching or interacting with this video. So let's just do our best to reason together.
Absolutely. Now, Tyson, it seems like Dr. Craig really enjoys conversations with Alex. Am I misreading that, or because it seems like he converses with him often?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. He finds Alex to be winsome and civil most of the time, and things went a little different in this dialogue. He got a little bit more emotional than he usually does, but I mean, still, Alex is very well spoken. And it seems like he has a deep interest in philosophy, and especially philosophy of religion. And so Dr. Craig really enjoys the fact that he's digging deeply into these issues and trying to find answers. And their dialogues always go really well. Dr. Craig always comes away afterwards feeling like that was a really good talk. And I think mainly because most of the time, it seems like they have this sort of professor-student dynamic where it seems like the majority of the time is Dr. Craig teaching him something. So he loves teaching. So
yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think when we were talking about doing this and I was watching it, I texted and said, it kind of feels like watching somebody teach somebody else just live, just because Alex will make some comments. We'll look at it here shortly, and then Dr. Craig will just go into, well, that's not exactly right because, and then he just kind of does a 5-minute lecture on the topic. And I thought that was interesting. I want to say that Alex is a genuinely intelligent person, like we've said before. So none of this is casting aspersions on his intelligence. I mean, I will say he's probably a smarter person than I am, but that doesn't mean the reasoning is sound either. So I think Dr. Craig does a great job of pointing those things out, but I love the professorial tension there. It did feel like he was almost taking Alex under his wing and saying, well, let's think about it more clearly this way. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I think that's right. I have had Dr. Craig as a professor, and I remember even back in 2012, sitting in his classroom, I remember and I've talked about this on YouTube before, but the first question I ever asked him, I was so nervous, and I finally worked up the courage to raise my hand in class, and he called on me by name, which blew me away because he just met me as well. But he tries to remember all the students' names. He has everybody say hello and to introduce themselves. And I probably raised my hand about a half hour into class, and he called me by name. Meant a lot to me. But the first question I asked him was, well, how do you define a moment? What is a moment? And this was something that he discussed with Alex O'Connor in this conversation, or, I wouldn't call this a debate, kind of turned into, there was something debate adjacent, I guess. Yeah. But it's a fantastic conversation. loved it. And one thing I want to say about Alex is I have become somewhat of a fan of his work. And by that, I mean, I really enjoy watching him and listening to him and listening to him interact with others, whether they be Christians or non-Christians. And, you know, in his teenage years is when he got famous on YouTube. And I didn't really like the young Alex O'Connor, but as he's matured over the years, you know, and I believe he went to Oxford and majored in philosophy. And the educated Alex O'Connor is somebody who I would just love to spend some time with. I think he's doing great work right now. It doesn't mean I agree with him. In fact, I often disagree with him, but I still like his work. And, you know, last week I wrote and published an article on the FreeThinking Ministries website, responding to his objection against the existence of God, or at least against what I would say against the existence of a maximally great and perfectly loving being. And that is the objection raised from animal suffering. We're going to get into that later. We're going to talk about the Kalam and some other things first today. But with all that said, we're going to be critiquing some things that Alex has said. But to your point, Josh, all three of us here respect Alex immensely. I would love to interact with him personally. Alex, if you see this, you're more than welcome to be a guest on our show anytime. And we really consider that an honor.
And not just because it would increase our audience, although it would do that.
It would do that.
So we're going to take a look at a few clips here. But first, I do want to say Tyson has moved all the way across the country. And so he's in the various stages of unpacking. But this was so important that he wanted to drop everything and tell his wife to unpack herself. I'm just kidding. He wanted to drop everything to have this conversation here today. So if it's a little glitchy, that might be part of the reason why. But we're excited to do this. Anything you want to add to that, Tyson, or are we good to get started?
I mean, just we had a big move from Las Vegas to Virginia, so I actually see green out the window again. Although with that green comes mosquitoes, which I'm not excited about. So, but yeah, still unpacking, still getting settled in, and don't have great Wi-Fi reception. So yeah, like you said, if I'm glitchy, that's why.
All right.
We'll let it pass.
Yep. All right. Let's get into. So we're going to look at 6 clips, and again, we anyone who wants to watch the whole thing, it's going to be linked in the description below. If you want to read Tim's article, it'll be linked in the description below as well. We encourage you to watch the whole thing. Make sure we're not taking things out of context, all that sort of stuff. So here's the first clip. We are going to get into discussion on, I think this is part of a Hilbert's Hotel discussion. So I think this is only a few seconds clip. Let's take a look.
I mean, there are 2 ways in which we could understand the hotel being full. Either full means that it can take no more guests, in which case Hilbert's Hotel simply isn't full because it can take new guests. So maybe by full, what we mean is every room is occupied. That's fine. Okay, every room is occupied, but you can also acquire new guests. That's true even in non-infinite examples. Like if I had a finite hotel and every single room was full, but if a new guest came into the room, into the hotel, I could just build a new room for them. I could say, no vacancy, like at least every room is full, and yet new guests can be admitted.
Okay, so this is the famous Hilbert's Hotel example, and then he takes it into even a finite hotel. Tyson, tell me where things are, what's going on here, and where things might be off.
So the first thing to say is like we kind of just jumped ahead in all this. At the very beginning, Dr. Craig, this whole dialogue is supposed to be about, the reasons to believe that God exists. Are there good reasons to believe he exists? Are there good reasons to believe he doesn't exist? Dr. Craig gives several arguments, and unfortunately, the moderator didn't really do a good job of managing the time that they spent on each section, and so they really spent an unreal amount of time on just one aspect of one argument, namely the Kalam Cosmological Argument.
And we probably should know that the moderator that started the debate kind of got sick and was having a heart attack or something.
Coughing fit.
Right. Yeah,
So
he
a
ended up
guy-
defending too, which was kind of weird. Yeah.
So a guy that was not thinking he was going to moderate ended up getting thrusted into the moderating role
In the middle of it.
Perhaps didn't handle it as seamlessly as one would hope. Again, I don't fault him for that, because maybe I would do the same thing. But you're right. It became kind of a long. It almost was like watching a discussion at a coffee shop that never got directed to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So
this
not
is one thing-
entirely the moderator's fault, for sure. Oh, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say this, this is one reason why I like formatted debates that include some of the cross-examine. This is probably like a big cross-examination or a discussion. Whereas with a formal debate, each person gets 20 minutes to open, then you have your rebuttals, maybe another rebuttal after that, and then a cross-examination with closing statements. And I do appreciate that now. And with how this one kind of went off the rails, it made me kind of wish that this would have been done in more of an academic format. What do you think about that, Tyson?
Yeah, I think even if it wasn't a formal debate, just having a set amount of time for maybe each argument, for them to discuss each argument and every subpoint of the arguments that they wanted to address would have been helpful. But there just wasn't a whole lot of organization of this. You see this in the topics that they cover, and even in the Q&A. There just wasn't a lot of strong moderation to this whole dialogue. But setting that aside, they did get into the weeds in the Kalam argument, which has some benefit, but it would have been nice for them to address more. Like, I know Alex wanted to talk about the first premise of the Kalam, which is everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? They didn't even get into the causal premise. So mainly they spent their time on the second premise, which is the universe began to exist. And in this particular clip, we're hearing about one of the philosophical arguments against an actual infinite. Which is supposed to show that the universe began to exist because the universe doesn't have an actually infinite past, right? Or actually infinite number of past moments. So that's where Hilbert's hotel comes in. You've got this hotel that supposedly has an infinite number of rooms, and the manipulation of these rooms with guests is supposed to show that it's very unlikely or unintuitive that there could be an actually infinite number of things, namely guests. And so Alex is pushing against that. He's saying, no. Even though it's unintuitive, it still makes sense. We can still make sense of what it means for there to be an actually infinite number of guests, and manipulating those numbers, moving them around to different rooms. And so we shouldn't just dismiss the idea that the universe had an infinite past just because it's unintuitive. Hilbert's hotel, he says, doesn't give us any reason to dismiss the idea that the universe is past eternal. So in this clip, he says, if I had a finite hotel or infinite hotel and every single room was full, if a new guest came into the room, I could just build a new room for them, right? Even if I had an infinite number of rooms and they were all full, like there was a guest in every one of them, I could just build a new room for this new guest that comes in, right? And so what he's suggesting there is it's not the case that if you have an infinite hotel that you have to do anything weird in order to accommodate a new guest, even though there's already a guest in every room in an infinite hotel. This actually, though, misses the point that Dr. Craig was trying to get across, right? It doesn't matter how many rooms you add on, you still have this very unintuitive consequence when you're dealing with inverse operations. What are inverse operations? Well, it's subtracting or dividing, right? And you can't do that with an actual infinite. Mathematicians are like, no, we can't do that because we end up with contradictory results. So it doesn't matter.
So to put it one way, yeah. So to put it simply, it's like what the question is: what does it even mean to add one to an infinite? Right?
Yeah, yeah. You still have an actually infinite number of rooms, right? Yeah. So that's strange on its face, like. It doesn't make any sense to say you have the same quantity as you did before, even though you're adding one to it, right? That it's just in reality, you know that if you have a number of rooms and you add one more, there's more rooms. So it's counterintuitive in that sense to add one to an actual infinite. But, somebody like Alex, he just bites the bullet and he says, yes, when you're dealing with infinities, it's very counterintuitive. And I think we're going to cover, the dismissal of intuitions later on. But suffice it to say that Dr. Craig's point in bringing up Hilbert's Hotel is because of these contradictory answers dealing with inverse operations in actual infinities, it makes it highly implausible that an actually infinite could be real in the physical world. And that's all you really need in order to run this argument.
Yeah. And then there's a difference between being able to count in an actual infinite and being able to count in a potential infinite, right? You still have a starting point. There was one room, and then there were two, and so on and so forth, and you could go into a potential infinity, but you still had a starting point, which is interesting because I think the example he brings up is like, even in a finite, I could just build another room. Well, yes, because that makes sense because you had a starting point. So you're talking about a potential infinite. Yeah, you could potentially always build another room, but you had a starting point. So it doesn't answer the actual infinity problem for those who are watching. If they're wondering about potential and actual, those are different things, and all of those play on our intuitions as well, and the fact that we just intuit the fact that these are impossible, and it's also mathematically shown as well. But Alex has an interesting take on intuitions that I want to get our read on here. So let's get to that clip here shortly.
Bear in mind that when we are forced into extreme philosophical circumstances, we are very often asked to give up some of our most foundational intuitions. The Christian asks us to believe that God is one and yet three at the same time, which many people find profoundly unintuitive, and most of the time is defended as a kind of mystery of faith that we'll never properly understand. We have to put our intuitions on the shelf and accept that this must be true. In the quantum realm, we're told that particles can be particles and waves at the same time, that superposition is a thing. That superposition is a thing.
There's the moderator leaving because he got sick or whatever. And I could tell Tyson that, oh man, when he brought up the Trinity, Dr. Craig really, really wanted to weigh in there. He even says something there. I know Tim was probably feeling the same way. Yeah. But this idea of having to let go of our intuitions when we're faced with some philosophical understanding, and he brings up some Christian ideas.
Yeah, I think it's important that we update our intuitions when we have good reason to, right? When we're introduced to new evidence, or we're introduced to new ideas that are strong and reasonable and rational, we should update our intuitions. There are a lot of people that when they first learn Christian doctrine, it's very unintuitive to say that we can have free will and yet God can be omniscient, right? Or have exhaustive providence over all of reality. But as you and I, as we believe, there are concepts which are able to reconcile these. And so once you understand the concepts, it no longer becomes unintuitive, right? And I think the same goes for a lot of these issues that Alex raises. He raises the issue of the Trinity, and he says, Christians ask us to believe that God is one and yet three at the same time, and that we have to, leave our intuitions at the door and accept it as a kind of mystery of the faith. Well, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying that you have to leave your intuitions at the door. Yeah. What we're saying is that you need to have clear concepts and precise definitions in order to understand how God is one and how God is three, and not that they're the same concepts of one and three.
That's
at
right.
the same time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say it was kind of a straw man of the Trinity. I know he was saying it really quickly, but it was like, oh, well, not exactly. Let's flesh that out a little bit more, which is why I think Dr. Craig I'd like to talk about that.
Right. And Tyson knows this. His last weekend in Las Vegas, I was also there, and I was taking part in a debate with some Mormons, with some folks from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one of their objections was that the concept of the Trinity is logically incoherent. And I said, oh, no, it's not. It is completely coherent once we define terms. And so, yes, when Alex formulated it quickly to his, as you said, Josh, and he said, we're asked to believe that God is one and yet three at the same time. I never put it that way. I say, no, God is one what and three whos, or something along those lines. And then we offer thought experiments. Dr. Craig does this on a regular basis with Cerberus or Kerberos. I think that's how Dr. Craig likes to say it. And with the three-headed guard dog of mythology. And, suppose that Hercules slays Kerberos. And now the soul of, there's one soul that survives the death of the dog's body, but it's one soul with three centers of consciousness. Well, now we can say that that is one immaterial thing, but three whos. And so, look, we can, I'm not going to ask anybody to just give up their intuitions. I don't do that. I, for one, do not just give up my intuitions. I try to make sense of it. And as Tyson knows, I mean, he and I have been talking about this for years now to this point. How do we reconcile the idea that God is completely sovereign and can even predestine the future without causally determining the future and leaving human libertarian free will intact? Well, we've spilled tons of ink on this topic. And I am not one of those Christians who is simply going to give up intuitions. I want reason to believe what I believe. But I like what Tyson says. We do at times need to update our intuitions. And, and Alex O'Connor brought up the quantum mechanics thing, or the quantum realm. And for me, I'm like, okay, maybe that's about as, I don't see anything in my Christian theology where I have to do that. But yes, I am asked to give up my intuitions at times when it comes to the quantum realm. But there's so many different interpretations of quantum mechanics out there right now. None of these things are settled. And I write about this a little bit in my book as well. So the jury is still out on if we need to give up our intuitions on this or not. But Tyson, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to address the quantum issue. He says, in the quantum realm, we're told that particles can be particles and waves at the same time. It's not quite correct. It's that, particles, subatomic particles, can behave like particles, and they can behave like waves, depending, or have the properties of both, depending on how we observe them. Right. And so this doesn't at all mean that they are actually particles or actually waves in different ways, or both at the same time. And that's somehow, coherent. Right. What it means is that our methods of observation are giving us different information. But that's not counterintuitive. We experience that all the time in real life. Somebody made the analogy of something called a horse-house duality. So we talk about particle-wave duality. Let's talk about horse-house duality to describe a train. A train moves like a horse, right? It moves forward, but you can sit in it like a house. So it has properties of both a horse and a house. But does that mean that it is either a horse or a house, or that it's some combination of both? No, of course not. What it is a train. And so likewise, just because subatomic particles have this sort of behavior doesn't mean that it's one or the other, that, it's because you're taking aspects of it and kind of abstracting it, or the particular way you're observing is giving you particular information. So it doesn't overturn our intuitions at all. It just means that we need more information, we need more perspective, and that can help us to understand the phenomenon better.
Yeah, and what, to your guys' point, and then we'll move on to the next topic, but to your guys' point, it seems to me that as he's talking, he kind of is almost, the limiting principle you guys are forwarding is you have to have good reasons to give up your intuitions. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that Alex communicates that. It seems like it's like, well, Hilbert's Hotel could represent an actual infinite, and it's non-intuitive, but an actual infinite could still exist. It's kind of a mystery. And I was kind of like, hey, that's not a good reason. And if a Christian did that, with anything, then it would be God of the gaps, right? Like, well, it's a mystery. God just does it. And so it's like, I don't think what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? It's like, I don't think that you can just kind of shrug and say, yeah, well, I don't buy the Hilbert's hotel argument because the infinity could actually obtain, actual infinity could obtain, and it's just not intuitive. And so I don't think that that is a proper or a good response, because there is no, what I would call like a limiting principle to that line of thinking. What keeps me from then shrugging and pointing to mystery for all sorts of things that are intuitively in opposition to what I usually think and believe? Then I could reason myself into all sorts of different positions, even if they rub up against my intuitions for no good reason. So that's the last point that I would say. Anything you guys would add to that before we move on? Or
I think we're ready.
All right, here we go. Let's go to the next section. Oops, I thought I had it queued up. There we are.
Occur. Hawking and Penrose, whom you mentioned, in their 1996 book, state, and if I can quote from memory, today almost everyone believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning in the Big Bang. So the finitude of the past, let me now add an additional point, doesn't require a singular beginning in the universe. Hawking and Hartle, James Hartle of University of California.
I'm going to pause it for a second. This is kind of a long clip, but for clarification, they're talking about the initial beginning of the universe and the Big Bang and the cosmological argument, just in case people are kind of lost as what's talking about. Am I getting the context right there, Tyson?
Yeah, so this is moving on from the philosophical arguments supporting the second premise, that the universe began to exist, to the scientific evidence. Some people say, well, if you can round it off at the bottom, it means it doesn't have a beginning. And Dr. Craig is like, no, it doesn't matter whether it's rounded or it has a point at a singularity. Any of those models show that the universe had an absolute beginning in the finite past.
Yeah, so let's watch. I think it's another minute of the clip we have, and then we'll discuss a little bit more further.
Santa Barbara offered a quantum physical model of the universe that resolved the singularity. They were able to round off that initial space-time segment of the universe so that there is no singular point like a cone has. A cone has a point in which it cannot be extended. That's where the point is. A cone can be extended in the other direction. And the standard Big Bang model has the geometry of a cone. But the Hartle-Hawking model got rid of that initial point by rounding it off through the use of imaginary numbers for the time coordinate. So their model has a finite past, a beginning of the universe, but is singularity free. And so don't think that my argument for the finitude of the past, the beginning of the universe, on the basis of astrophysical cosmology or Big Bang theory, assumes that it has to be a singular beginning. There are plenty of non-singular models with beginnings. So that would be the first body of evidence, is this astrophysical evidence from the expansion of the universe. But then,
okay, so he introduced, like he explained it again, like you had said. So the idea is it doesn't go down to a singularity, but it has more of a rounded point where it began in this area. And the point is, it's still finite. It's still beginning. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So some people who want to object to the Kalam argument, they'll say, because there are these non-singular models that don't come to a point, a singularity in the finite past, therefore you can escape this finitude and postulate a universe that is past eternal. It just doesn't work like that, because there's still a past space-time boundary past which the universe doesn't go. So that is a boundary that is constitutes the absolute beginning of the universe. And here, the reason I kind of wanted to talk about this clip is because a lot of people don't understand what the technical definition of begins to exist means, right? Part of the Kalam cosmological argument hinges on that. So, the whole thing, right?
I mean, the whole thing.
major- yeah. So the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The second premise, the universe began to exist. So what exactly is being meant by begins to exist? If you don't get that right, you're not going to understand the argument. And I didn't hear from Alex any sort of analysis of that, but it just doesn't seem like he maybe has a strong grasp of the technical meaning here. So Dr. Craig actually on the Reasonable Faith website defines very precisely what he means by begins to exist or temporal becoming. And it has three parts. First of all, he says something begins to exist at a time t if and only if it comes into being at t. So there's a particular time at which the thing comes into being. Number two, it comes into being at t if and only if it exists at t, and that's the first time it exists at that at which it exists. So there is a first time at which something exists. That's obviously when something comes into being, it can't exist at a time previous to the first time that it exists. And then finally, a thing comes into being if it exists at t, or it's existing at t, is a tensed fact. What do we mean by tensed fact? Well, it means that it has tense. It means that the things that that we talk about as being past, present, or future, that it's existing at a particular time is a tensed fact. It's not tenseless, right? It's not part of a space-time block that just exists and all times exist equally real across the entire space-time block, right?
B theory.
Right, B theory versus A theory. So those are the three conditions that Dr. Craig gives for defining what it means for something to begin to exist or come into being. And if you don't get that right, you're not going to understand the argument.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And none of that has to deal with one particular understanding of Big Bang cosmology.
Right. Yeah. That's just a stipulated definition of what Dr. Craig means by begins to exist. And it seems intuitive, right? We kind of get this intuitive. Again, we're leaning back on intuitions, but it seems pretty intuitive that a thing can't exist at a time previous to its first moment, or that something that exists tenselessly in this sort of static state can be said to have come into being, right? That just doesn't make any sense intuitively. So that's what he's...
Yeah. So while he was there, he also had a conversation with Alex Malpass, who I've debated before on the Unbelievable channel, if people want to see that. And I think it was Alex Malpass. I might be getting my wires crossed here, but when they were arguing about the beginning of the universe, saying, hey, this doesn't demonstrate that the universe came into existence from nothing. It demonstrates that there was this point of singularity that existed, and then that changed, right? Something along those lines. And I'm just thinking, well, okay, first of all, even if, is that a good explanation, saying that here's this little pebble, this atom, something smaller than an atom, this point of singularity that just exists in just the right manner, that even though there's nothing happening there's no time, there's no ticking clocks or anything like that. So there's nothing happening. Things aren't getting more unstable over time. Things aren't emerging over time. There's nothing happening in this static state, like you said, Tyson. So this would be a static state where this point of singularity just exists in just the right way that will then inexplicably explode, bang, into the universe, this fine-tuned universe as we have it. That just doesn't seem to be, it doesn't answer any questions. It just raises more questions. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that this point of singularity just exists. This very small universe, smaller than an atom, just exists in a timeless state. Well, it still seems like we could format the Kalam like this. Well, what caused the first change? And Alex wants to push back and say, well, what is a moment? Well, I would just say it's a change in state of affairs. When a state of affairs has changed, in any way, you can mark that down as a first moment. And then, so if somebody wants to say that we are living in a current state of change, all right, let's call this one state that we're in right now. There's a changing state right before that one and another one before that one. How many changes can you have? And I think you can start talking about, and I think Dr. Craig even did mention this in the conversation with O'Connor when he's talking about events. And I think he did quickly mention, well, an event is a moment of change or an instance of change or something like that. But I think it helps to start thinking about changing states of affairs, and can we have an infinite amount of changes reaching to the current state of change? And I think there you could say no, we can't, because that can't be extrapolated into past infinity. Am I making sense, Tyson? What would you add to that?
Yeah, just going back to the concept of a singularity, right? It's this idea that that's state of affairs, physical state of affairs that's infinite, infinite density and infinitesimally small, basically.
Yeah.
And so part of the problem here is that not all scientists agree that the singularity is an actual thing. They use it as a kind of stand-in for this area of physics that we can't really deal with mathematically because of the presence of an actually infinite density. So they can't do anything with it. It's just kind of like, some physicists treat it as sort of a heuristic device, right?
Okay.
It's just there to kind of help us leap off from, right? But no, not all cosmologists or physicists treat the singularity as an actual physical state. But yeah, the second thing is, like you said, when you're postulating a singularity as the explanation for the universe, well, you need to do some more explaining. You need another account of how it is that this singularity exists in the first place. Is it a brute fact? Does it exist necessarily? What good reason do you have for believing either of those things? And then you have to postulate, well, how is it that this thing that exists in a timeless state, if that's your view, how is this thing in a timeless state suddenly and spontaneously changing to produce the physical universe, right? And that's why Dr. Craig postulates, as the cause of the universe, something which is immaterial, right? And again, there are physicists that believe the singularity isn't a thing. So something that's immaterial that has free will. Or is it an abstract object? He gives both of those options. Abstract objects can't cause anything. That's what it means to be an abstract object. They don't have any causal power. So the most plausible option is that what caused the universe is an unembodied mind capable of freely bringing about spontaneous effects, right? And this goes back to intuition. We have this very strong intuition that we're capable of spontaneously choosing things and bringing about new causal chains that bring about new effects that aren't the necessary result of the past history. That makes sense. But just having some timeless thing called the singularity spontaneously bringing about a change, that doesn't explain anything. You're just postulating something. You're using words, putting a combination of words together without actually providing mechanism or explanatory progress to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm going to spontaneously interrupt here and ask people if they like this conversation to spontaneously hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. It will then start a cause and chain of events that will be amazing. So please do that. I can't really promise that, but it could happen. So like the videos, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell as well. And Tim, you were going to read something from a book, it looks like, since you put your readers on.
Yes, that's right. That's right. All right. So here's something I put again in this Mere Molinism book. Regarding time and things changing over time. So premise 1, things change over time. And I said, i.e. evolution occurs. 2, a sequence of real temporal changes cannot be infinite in the past. 3, therefore, the sequence of changes had a beginning, a first change. 4, a first change cannot arise from a changeless state unless it is caused by a volitional agent with the power to initiate change. 5. Volitional agents are by definition personal beings. 6. Therefore, a personal agent existed in a changeless state of affairs. 7. Any entity existing in a changeless uncaused state is eternal and without beginning. 8. Therefore, the cause of the first change, and thus the source of the evolving state of affairs we now observe, is an eternal personal agent who existed in a changeless state logically prior to initiating change, or the first change. So, yeah, not only would this being have to be immaterial, it has to have free will, and it seems to be an immaterial free thinking thing that is not caused to act by something or someone else, but can initiate that first change from within, can make the choice to act or not to act. And this starts sounding like what we call God very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. God is the singularity. All right, let's move forward in our conversation here with Alex and Dr. Craig.
In order to define what an event is, you sort of arbitrarily pick a moment of a sort of duration of time and just count how many of those there have been. For example, hours. But the point is that there is no such thing as an objective hour. There's no such thing as the length of an hour. I mean this seriously. If you, when satellites were first sent into orbit around this planet, scientists of general relativity told the technicians and the companies that the clock will literally run at a different rate because of the effects of Earth's mass on the ticking of time. And the government didn't believe them. And so the original satellites were sent up with two clocks. One which is in accordance with general relativity, and one which is in accordance with the sort of commonsensical view that time ticks normally for everybody no matter where you are. And guess who was right? It was the government. I'm just kidding. It was the scientists. Time doesn't tick consistently in this way. And so to sort of pick an arbitrary length of time, like an hour, and just say that that's something that will have gone on infinitely into the past, I just don't think that's how time works. And I don't think that, like, metaphysically speaking, to call that an event makes much sense. I mean, like, you said that the problem with Aristotle and his interpretation of the past as a potential infinite.
Okay, I think that's a lot of what we just talked about, but I think he's kind of picking at how we measure time on Earth as if that's how we're defining an event, which it's clearly not. Am I missing that, or am I?
He's saying something a little more bold here. He's making a claim about the nature of time based on what he thinks science says. What he's saying is that time actually goes slower because of the effects of general relativity, right? That's what he's saying. But that's not actually what science shows. Now, it could be the case that time is going slower for certain objects because of the effects of general relativity and their mass and acceleration and things like that. But it could equally be the case empirically that the effects are merely slowing the timekeeping devices themselves. So just because clocks run slower doesn't mean necessarily that time is running slower, right? We're all familiar with the fact that some of our watches run faster than others, right? Does that mean that, that time is running faster for one watch and not the other? Of course not. So if something is affecting the timekeeping device's ability to stay in sync with absolute time, then you would expect it to either run slower or faster or whatever. And so this is perfectly consistent with there being an absolute objective time measurement that we're just not capable of measuring because of our finite physical timekeeping devices. And that's why. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and to add to that, the human body, the human mind, is also some sort of timekeeping device. So we could experience those same effects and experience time differently, but that doesn't mean that time is actually, the absolute time is changing.
Right. Yeah. So Yeah. So there's another concept called psychological time, where time flies when you're having fun. That's a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but yeah, definitely, you could use your body as a timekeeping device if you wanted to, I guess.
But like, I mean, you get caught. I'm thinking of like Interstellar. They get caught in the well of the black hole, and so 40 years have gone by on Earth, and he's experienced 2 hours or whatever.
Right.
Well, how they've experienced that time has changed, but the absolute time of the universe, like the universe expansion, that sort of thing.
Yeah, is the universe still 14 billion years old wherever you are, or is young Earth creationism true in the black hole?
Right. Yeah.
And again, this goes back to, I think, Alex saying, well, what is a moment? And Dr. Craig says, well, it's an event. And here he's saying, okay, well, how do you define event? And again, I would just go back to whenever there is an instance of change, or it's just simply whenever a change occurs. I mean, something has happened, and you can call that a moment. So even, and Dr. Craig has said this before, even with God's power in mind, does God have the power to erase and annihilate everything from existence that he's ever created? So it's just him existing as a Trinity alone once again. And, say, God's got the power to do that. And then he says, well, can God create again for the first time? And we're like, well, no. But even but here, what we've got here is instances of change. So God existed alone in a static state of aseity. Then something changed. God has created the universe. He did things, right? And then, according to this thought experiment, something else changes, and he erases it all from existence. So now it's only God again in a static state where there are no changes happening. But then the question is, could God make something change again for the first time? Could God create again for the first time? And the answer is obviously no. So even if God went back to a state where nothing is happening, he couldn't cause a first change. Again, it would be a change in a sequence of things. So again, for me, I just like using the language of change. Dr. Craig likes to use moments or events, things like that, but we're all referring to the same thing. It's just, I think, semantics to help clarify what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I want to make sure the audience understands just how radical Alex's claim here is. So what he's trying to say, here's kind of his argument in a nutshell. He's saying that because the passage of time is not constant, right, we can't really identify things such as events, right? He's saying, I don't even know what an event is basically what he's saying. Because he thinks they don't have any sort of objective duration, right? And if there are no events of objective duration, then we can't say that the number of past events in the universe of equal duration can't be infinite, right? So we don't have any idea what events actually are. We can't say that the universe doesn't have an actually infinite number of events because we just have no idea what we're talking about, is basically his argument. Two really big issues with that. So number one, again, it's not been proven that there are no events of objective duration. Like I said, the science just doesn't show that. So if he's making that claim that science does show that, he's wrong. It just doesn't prove that much. And then number two, if you can't tell that one event, like watching the Mandalorian and Grogu movie that just came out, if you can't tell that that movie is objectively longer in duration than another event, say watching a YouTube short, then you've really just done away with all of science.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because that means our senses just aren't equipped to say anything about reality at that point.
Right. Yeah.
Is that what you're really prepared to say? That we can't really know whether or not the Mandalorian and Grogu movie is longer than watching a YouTube short? That's quite a big bullet to bite.
Yeah, a very expensive price tag. But I'll just say, as a Mandalorian fan, can't tell, watching that movie seemed like an actual infinite amount of time. It was horrible. Come on, guys. You can do better than that.
That's great. Thanks for pointing that out, Tyson. I do think that's important. And Alex, if you watch this, or he might say, "Well, I'm just asking the question, like, can we actually know for certain?" But he's also making a proposal at the same time as he's doing that. Hey, we hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. Hey, please do us a favor, check and see if you're subscribed. If you're not, a lot of you aren't, but if you're not, please subscribe, hit that notification bell. We'll get back to the episode in just a second, but we can only exist also because of viewers like you, people who support our channel. So you can go to freethinkingministries.com/donate and you can be a part of the team. We'd love to put you on our email list as well. Okay, now back to the conversation.
In then the specificity of God's knowledge.
The specificity.
Yes, and like what your theory of truth is, because I don't know what your theory of truth is. Mine is not the correspondence theory of truth, but it's the most popular theory of truth, that for some kind of belief to be true, it must correspond with a fact and reality. I can understand the idea that God kind of intuits all truth all at once or something like that. That's fine.
Okay.
But the truths that he knows, that he apprehends, have to correspond to reference. There have to be things which they refer to. If it's knowledge of the physical world, of which
correspondence view of truth,
which means
so reality is as God knows it to be.
So even if the mode of God's knowledge is instantaneous, the content of that knowledge consists in reference to an actually infinite number of physical things. Something you say.
Well, now you're not importing these into God's mind. It sounds to me like you're wanting to have an actually infinite number of propositions that God knows. And here again, I would say that describes the range of God's knowledge, but not the mode of his knowledge. And as an anti-Platonist, I don't think the propositions exist.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, break that down for us.
Yeah, so I wanted to go over this clip because I think it's extremely important. So what they're talking about, Alex brings up this idea that, if actual infinites can't exist, then God can't know an actually infinite number of things, right? And so obviously God is omniscient. He should know an infinite number of things, right? There's an infinite number of numbers. There's an infinite number of facts. So God should know an actually infinite number of things. And Dr. Craig is pushing back on that. The first thing to note is that Alex says something very curious. He says he doesn't hold to a correspondence theory of truth, which makes me really curious. Like, what is his theory of truth? I would love to hear it. I'm not aware of, him actually describing his theory of truth anywhere. So if somebody, one of the audience members can dig that up and share that in the comments, that'd be great. Because that seems to be, again, one of the most intuitive theories of truth. But he has a very curious interpretation of that theory. If you notice, when you go back, he says that in order for a proposition to correspond to reality, there has to be some referent. There has to be something that the proposition latches onto in order to make it true, right? And we call that truth maker theory, right? There has to be something in reality that the proposition attaches onto in order to make it true. But correspondence theory actually doesn't require that, okay? And we can see this in certain propositions that we know are true, but there is no referent, right? So for instance, there are no krakens, right? If I make that statement, I've made a proposition that's true. There are no krakens as far as we know. But let's just say there really aren't any krakens. There are no krakens. So there's nothing out there in reality that proposition latches onto in order to make that true. All we need for that proposition to be true is that there is an absence of krakens. Okay, so it's not the case that there is a referent out there that makes that true. That could be true even if there was nothing at all, right? There are no krakens if there's nothing at all, right? But then you don't have any sort of objects to be referenced. So anyway, he just has a really confused view of the correspondence theory of truth that suggests that there needs to be actual physical things for each proposition to be true. And that's just not the case. So Dr. Craig rejects that idea of the correspondence theory of truth. The second thing Dr. Craig says is he rejects the existence of abstract objects. So this includes propositions, properties, sets, numbers, things like that. So if there are no such things as propositions, then an actually infinite number of propositions in God's mind doesn't really affect God knowing an infinite number of things, because there are no such things as propositions. Propositions are just the word that we use to describe certain thoughts or whatever. And you don't need things called propositions in order to be thinking about something. All you need is a mind and an activity, namely thinking. So you don't need that. And this is so huge. I wish I could get every single person to understand Dr. Craig's view of God and abstract objects, because I think it's so important for precisely using our language, not committing yourself to more than you have to, and actually making better sense of the world. I love to ask people, this is one of my favorite questions to ask people ever. Do numbers exist? Right? I love asking people that question, especially to Christians, because they've never thought about this. The reason that's important is like, okay, most Christians will say, yes, numbers exist. Okay, and then you ask, well, did God create them? And of course, they're not God, so of course he created them. He created everything other than himself. And then you ask them this all-important follow-up question: if God created numbers, was it true that there was one God that existed prior to him creating numbers? Right?
Yeah.
How could there be one God that existed prior to him creating numbers? And it's worse for Christians, because we believe in a triune God.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
How can there be three persons in the Trinity prior to God creating numbers? You can't have three of anything if you don't have numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Craig says, well, this isn't a problem on my view, because numbers aren't things that actually exist, even though we can use them in true sentences. We actually do this all the time in real world language. Like if I said, my walk this morning was refreshing. Okay, that might be a true statement. It's not, because it was raining this morning, but it could have been true. So I used the word walk as a noun or an object in the sentence, but that doesn't mean that I think there's a thing out there in the world, an object called a walk, right? So just because we use a word like an object in a sentence doesn't mean we're committed to there being an object in the world, and that's what makes it true. And the same way, we can use things like propositions, and we can have true propositions without there being propositions out there in the world that make them true, right? So I think that's a very important point, one that Alex probably hasn't dug into. The last thing on this particular clip is that Alex assumes that God's mode of cognition is discursive. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that he believes that the way that God thinks is one thought after another, like us. Like when we're thinking one thought after another. When we're reasoning, we're thinking of one point after another, or one premise after another to reach a conclusion, right? And Dr. Craig rejects that idea of the mode of God's cognition. Instead, Dr. Craig uses the analogy of our field of vision. Right? When you look out into the world, your field of vision is undifferentiated, meaning it just appears as a whole, right? There's no lines in your vision, hopefully, if you have good vision. There's no, divisions in there, like spots or anything that come together to form the picture. It's just the picture. This is compared to the differentiation that you see, for instance, in the picture of a television or a computer monitor, right? Those pictures are made of little pixels that come together to form the picture, right? So if we relate that to God's knowledge isn't like a bunch of propositions smushed together to form all of his knowledge, the set of all of his knowledge. Rather, God's knowledge, Dr. Craig believes, is more like this undifferentiated field of vision that he has all at once. And if that's even possibly true, then this undercuts Alex's assumption that God can't know an actually infinite number of things, because God's knowledge isn't broken up into little bits like that.
Yeah, I like how you note that God's knowledge is not discursive. One thing that I've I've said, and sometimes it gets me in trouble, is I say, well, God is not rational. And then I'm like, let me tell you what I mean by that.
But yes.
Then I say, well, he is in one sense, but he doesn't engage in deliberation to rationally infer the best explanation over time, right? Unlike that's what humans can do, but God can't do that. Why? Because he has a perfect set of beliefs. We can say he's rational in another sense, that in that he does not hold any contradictory beliefs, or he doesn't hold any irrational beliefs. So in that sense, he's rational, but he does not infer best explanations over time like humans do, because our reasoning is discursive, and God's is not. I also want to touch on the theory of truth. You know, I remember back when I had J.P. Moreland at Biola, and I was sitting in the front row, and he was teaching on truth, and I raised my hand, and I said, well, as Pilate said to Jesus, what is truth? And he goes, oh, good question. A statement that is true corresponds to reality. And I immediately raised my hand again. He goes, yeah. And I said, well, what is reality? And he goes, the way things are. I'm like, oh, nice. And so I ran with that for a long time. But now, you know, as I think about it more, I do hold the correspondence theory, but I would say a statement that is true corresponds to the way things are, the way things were or have been, the way things will be, or the way things could have been if things would have been different. Say if God would have created differently, or something along those lines. And I think each of those things can be true, but it's all going to be really go back to God and his the nature of a maximally great being. What does this God have the power to do? Could he have created differently? Could he have refrained from creation? It's all ultimately going to be corresponding to the ultimate way in which things are, or at least the ultimate thing in which everything else is contingent. But yeah, what do you think, Tyson, when I use that kind of language, like a statement that is true corresponds to the way things are, the way things have been, the way things will be, or the way things could have been if things were different?
Yeah, I think you're touching on different tenses there, you know, past, present, and future, and then also counterfactuals, right? The way things could have been. And I think, you know, the way the correspondence theory can capture all of that, right? All that's necessary is that the statements that we make, in order for them to be true, are correspond to what is inside that statement. So Dr. Craig uses what's called the disquotation principle. So let's say you have, you know, this statement like the snow is white, and you put that in quotations. Is that statement true? Well, Dr. Craig says that all you need for that statement to be true is to take away the quotations. Is it the case that the snow is white? If it is, then that statement, the snow is white, is true. So the truth predicate is really about the statement itself. Is that statement true? And then in order to figure that out, you figure out if what's inside that statement corresponds with reality. That's it. You don't need some object out there for it to latch onto in order for that statement to be true.
We're going to move forward to Alex's major, I guess,
Objection.
His major objection to theistic belief. But before we do that, I do want to say there's like a 10-minute clip, I think, in this where I think it's towards the end where Dr. Craig outlines 6 arguments like in rapid succession. And I think he closes with the ontological argument, or at least he doesn't call it that, but that's what he's talking about. And he's saying, given if all of these arguments hold, then the best explanation of the universe is Christian theism. So I encourage people to watch the whole thing, because I think that's a great little clip of, hey, these apologetic arguments, they all actually work in concert together. They're not individual arguments that you're picking and, oh, this is the only one I'm going to use. They actually work in concert. And once you do that, a beautiful explanation for creation, for who God is, for the universe, for Christian theism, all comes together. So I did want to plug that before we move forward. Anything you guys want to say about that as I get it queued up here?
Well, I think I was going to say, along to your point, that it is interesting in this next section on the problem of animal suffering, that Dr. Craig actually brings in another one of the arguments for the existence of God to undercut Alex's point. So again, the interconnectedness there, and how one argument might bolster another argument. That happens in this next section.
Yep. You know, and I talk about this in the blog article on our website that we that I published last week. So Dr. Craig's exactly right that the problem of animal suffering does nothing to refute the Kalam, does absolutely nothing to refute the conclusion of the fine-tuning argument or the free-thinking argument from reason, whatever. I mean, there's so many different arguments that we can, the Leibnizian argument from contingency. You bring up the problem of animal suffering or any other problem of evil, and these things do absolutely nothing to these conclusions, these theistic conclusions. But I do think, ultimately, at the end of the day, that this is an objection to the first premise of the ontological argument. For those familiar with the ontological argument, the first premise is it's possible that a maximally great being exists. Well, it seems to me that what Alex is doing here is saying, wait a second, no, it's not possible. Given what we experience in the real world, this would not be the case if a maximally great being exists. So I think what Alex could do here is say, well, look, yeah, there is a supernatural, very powerful, extremely intelligent, maybe mostly loving creator of the universe. But let's not pretend he's perfect. I think that's what he's doing. Let's not pretend he's a maximally great being. I can imagine I can conceive of a greater being. I think that's what he's doing here. And if he's not, this is as far as his objection is going to get. But I think we have good reasons. I think we have defeaters to his defeater.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that before we get there. But so what you might explain there as we get into it is that this seems to be a God that progressive Christians they'd say, see, Alex is onto something here, because they tend to think God is not maximally great. Sorry, that's kind of polemic, but I think it's also true. All right, let's listen. This is kind of a longer clip. Maybe we'll stop and go. I don't know, but let's listen to it.
I want to talk about that because I think that there is a class of individuals who are usually completely ignored in the discussion of suffering. And so, of course, non-human animals.
Yes.
Theodicies that are provided for the suffering, the existence of suffering, the fact that there's human free will, the fact that there was a fall, the fact that our souls will somehow be developed, the fact that higher order goods like bravery and courage can be achieved are plausible. But none of them apply to non-human animals. None of them apply to these animals who, for hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah. I've written quite a bit on the problem of animal suffering.
I know. So perhaps you can rehash it, because I'd like to know why it is that you think that for these hundreds of millions of years, suffering is the defining quality of the animal experience, to the extent that this is the mechanism God chose to bring about complexity of life on Earth. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. Disease, predation, starvation, hundreds of millions of years. And for some reason, when we get to humans, something kind of special happens, we're ensouled, whatever it might be, such that our suffering gets to be redeemed, but not theirs.
Okay, so that's his main objection. And might I, before you guys chime in, might I add something real quickly? I'm really glad that this was a conversation with William Lane Craig instead of Ken Ham. All right.
Oh,
go.
That's good. Very true. This is a topic that I've been thinking about for years now. In 2019, I think I published my first article on our website about animal suffering, and it's evolved a lot since then. I think it's become
pun intended.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's become even stronger since then. But Alex here is saying, well, okay, fine. To his credit, he's at least saying, hey, well, all of these theodicies that Christians have advanced, well, that makes sense for humans. The suffering that they experience gets to be redeemed, but not the animals. And I'm like, hold on a second, not so fast. Why think a thing like that? Again, let's go back to, as Dr. Craig mentioned during this conversation, one man's modus tollens is another man's modus ponens. If let's go with the ontological argument. Given that the ontological argument is sound, I think we can use that to say, well, on some of these things, and say, well, wait a second, what would a maximally great being do here with animals? Would he allow their suffering to go on unredeemed? And here, I guess I would agree with Alex, and I said, no, I don't think he would do that. And so therefore I argue that things do wind up well for the animals as well. I argue that all animals go to heaven, number one, and I've got arguments for this that are also backed up biblically, right? So I have two different ways I go about this. I'll argue biblically, and then I'll argue based on the ontological argument, perfect being theology. And in fact, at this next year's Evangelical Philosophical Society, Phil Kahlberg and I are presenting a paper where we're starting with the ontological argument, and then we're going to unpack how we can get all of these different Christian theological propositions, beliefs, statements, without even touching scripture. Things like a Trinity, things like the incarnation. How can we get Christmas? How can we get Easter? Can we get this even if we didn't have a Bible? And I think we can even apply this to animals then. And so, look, number one, I argue that God has really good reason. If God is perfectly loving, I argue that God allows all kinds of evils and all kinds of suffering to happen in the world. And I'll share this argument here shortly. And then I go beyond that and I say, and here's why he allows animals to experience suffering and how their suffering can be redeemed. So there's so much of what Alex is assuming here that goes into his argument raised against the knowledge of the Christian God, or at least the maximally great being, that I'm just going to say, not so fast. I disagree with that, and I'm going to give you reasons why I disagree with it.
Yeah, and Dr. Craig's response is really to point to the teleological argument,
right?
And say,
now look, that's what I already touched on, and Dr. Craig is right to say, well, hold on a second here. This does nothing to the conclusion. Not only that, he's like, well, on theism, or on atheism, you would not, or at least naturalism, you wouldn't expect animals to be conscious in the first place. But going back to the fine-tuning argument, here we need theism and an intelligent designer to create the universe in just the right way so that consciousness can even be a thing at all. And I agree with that. I also saw Alex O'Connor's point saying, let's bracket the Kalam, bracket the Leibnizian argument, bracket fine-tuning, and say, okay, this is why I say this is really an objection to perfect being theology. And he even brings it up in this conversation, the God that Christians worship on Sunday mornings at church. And so I want to say, look, I see both of their points here. Dr. Craig is exactly right to say this doesn't get rid of any of our arguments for the creator God. A guy in the crowd that was arguing with Alex was saying, no, you start with the creator God. That's what we've got evidence for. And this does nothing. I agree with all that. But Alex's point is this a good God? Right? Yeah. We have this intelligent creator of the universe who fine-tuned the whole thing. Is he perfect? Is he perfectly loving? Is he good? That's a different question.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think he zeroes in on the Christian God portion of it, right? Because I think Alex would probably agree that the God of Islam would see no problem in the same pain and suffering and excruciating death of all sorts of beings. And so it's not an objection to theism in total, but into a particular version of theism. Tyson, what do you have to say to what we've been bantering about here?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he's particularly zeroing in on the Christian God and trying to maybe tacitly undermine the first premise of the ontological argument. Because, we're talking about how they didn't have enough time to address all of the other arguments. But really, if you can show that the idea of God or some feature of reality is inconsistent with the existence of God, then you don't need to go through all of those other arguments, right? Then you just have a good reason to believe that God doesn't exist. It's kind of like when people ask, why are you a Christian? You haven't studied all those other religions. Well, that's true. I haven't studied all other religions, but I have really good reasons to believe that Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then these other religions are false by definition, right? So, yeah, that's kind of the point here, I think, is that, if Alex does his job well, then he can undermine the motivation for believing in God at all.
Yeah. What do you guys think of the charge that someone might give that says, well, this is mostly an appeal to emotion that Alex is doing here? It's not actually an undermining of the first premise of the ontological argument. He's just wanting people to be emotional about animal suffering, even though we don't understand how animals really experience suffering. That I think Dr. Craig pointed out that the qualitative suffering is different between human beings and animals. And even though we don't know or understand that, it's really this appeal to emotion that if you can get an emotional response and a visceral reaction, then you might doubt the existence of God. How is that what he's doing, or is that an uncharitable way of painting what he's doing?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, there are evidential problems of evil that, they don't go as far as to say that the idea of God is logically incoherent, but they will say that certain aspects of reality make it improbable that God exists. The problem with that is talking about the ontological argument. If it's just improbable that the existence of God, if it's just improbable that God exists, then it's not logically impossible, which means that there is a possibility that God exists, which means that the first premise of the ontological argument is true, right? So there's that. That's all I would say about that, is that, and Dr. Craig presses at him on this. He asks him point blank, he's like, so you don't think that Alvin Plantinga put the death knell to the logical version of the problem of evil and suffering? And Alex he literally says, well, I just have my doubts about that. He's very non-committal about that. So he doesn't want to take a side one way or the other right now. So what he's really pressing is that probabilistic argument that the suffering in the world seems gratuitous, especially when you consider animals and the hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And therefore, it's improbable that God exists. Right. That's what he wants to argue.
Yeah. I think, obviously Alex has strong feelings about this. He seemed to get a little emotional during the debate, during the discussion, but I don't think his argument is based on emotion, even if it has the ability to tug on our emotional heartstrings, as it were. So in the article I published last week, I tried to steel man his argument. So it couldn't be accused of being just an emotional argument. So let me run through this. This is how I think Alex should format his argument deductively. So premise one, if a perfectly loving and all-powerful God exists, then we would not expect enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering. Premise two, if suffering has no plausible, morally sufficient justification, then it is reasonable to regard that suffering as unnecessary. 3, human suffering may plausibly be explained by appeals to libertarian freedom, soul-making, moral growth, redemption, character development, etc. 4, these explanations do not appear to apply to many cases of animal suffering. 5, animals have experienced immense suffering through disease, predation, starvation, parasitism, extinction, painful death, etc. 6, much animal suffering appears to lack plausible, morally sufficient justification. 7, therefore, much animal suffering appears unnecessary. 8, therefore, enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering appear to exist. 9, final conclusion, therefore, animal suffering appears less expected under perfect being theism than under naturalism. So I tried my best to steel man his argument. He didn't format it like this during the conversation, but do you guys think I steel manned his perspective here?
Yeah, I think that's pretty
I
close.
think so.
Cool. And so then what I'm going to do is say, I'm his claim that animal suffering appears unnecessary. I'm going to say, I'm going to explain why I think it's actually necessary in a certain sense. So before we get into that, is there anything else either of you would like to add on?
No, I'm going to go into a little bit about how animals experience pain in a minute, but yeah, go ahead. I'll do that after you.
Okay, because that's important. I want to talk about that as well. But again, and I published this in a couple books now and multiple places online. Also in a journal article with Jacobus Erasmus. But we said, for all we know, God created the one feasible, freedom-permitting world in which evil is ultimately defeated, and all who are not trans-world damned are saved. So, what I'm focused on here is not what's logically possible, but what is feasible when we're talking about humans created in the image of God, who have libertarian freedom, so that they can think rationally. That is, their thoughts and beliefs aren't determined by something or someone else or these antecedent conditions, but no, they are pilots of the ship of reason, as it were, to come to their own conclusions, to truly infer the best explanation about metaphysical reality if they're careful and they handle their reasoning powers responsibly, right? So if God has given us libertarian freedom, now we're not just talking about what's possible, but what is feasible. And that is how free creatures would freely choose if God were to create them. So again, let me say what the main point there. I said, for all we know, God created the one feasible, freedom-permitting world in which evil is ultimately defeated and all who are not trans-world damned are saved. And I say that a perfect, loving, powerful, maximally great being would create that world even if it's suffused with finite amounts of suffering and all kinds of suffering, and that would include even animal suffering. That's going to lead to an argument I've advanced. Again, you can find this in my recently published book. Premise 1, if God is omnibenevolent, perfectly loving, then he desires genuine eternal love relations or relationships with humans. Premise 2, if God desires genuine eternal love relationships with humans, then he creates humans with libertarian freedom because, 2.1, genuine eternal love relationships, among other goods, necessarily require libertarian freedom. 3, if God creates humans with libertarian freedom, then he permits humans to experience all kinds of suffering because, 3.1, evil and suffering can result from libertarian free humans, and 3.2, God created a world in which he knew, middle knowledge, that unless he permitted all kinds of suffering, some would not freely choose, libertarian freedom, to eternally preserve the suffering-free state of affairs in the new heavens and the new earth. And I point to 2 Corinthians 4:17 for biblical backing there. Premise 4, God is omnibenevolent, perfectly loving. Final conclusion, therefore, God permits humans to experience all kinds of suffering. Now, notice what follows from that. Moral evil, natural evil, divine hiddenness, seemingly gratuitous suffering, and yes, our awareness and knowledge that animal suffering is real. So now, it doesn't just end there with animals, but I talk about how even Alex seems to be learning from the pain that animals endure. I know that I have by watching my own pets, my beloved pets. I learn from their suffering. I don't like it. When I wake up in a perfect state of affairs, on the other side of death, where I'm looking into the eyes of Jesus and I realize my knees don't hurt anymore. And I realize that nobody else is suffering anymore. And then I realize all the animals are flourishing. And I even see my old dog Rondo, and he's no longer suffering. Am I going to take that state of affairs for granted and wreck it like Adam and Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels seem to do? Like, no, I'm going to do everything within my power to keep this perfect state of affairs perfect. So I like to say I'll have the same power, the same ability that Satan had to rebel in the presence of God, but I never would. I could, but I never would, because now I'm too smart for that, because I think Paul alludes to this in 2 Corinthians 4:17 when he says these light momentary afflictions prepare us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Well, why? Why do these light momentary afflictions and he provides a whole list of all of his pain and suffering that he's gone through, and he ultimately died for his faith. But he knows what it meant to suffer. But he's saying that all of this pain, evil, and suffering and this affliction prepares us for eternity. Well, I think that's exactly how God uses it without determining us. I call it the perseverance of free saints. So look, that includes what we learn from animal suffering. Now, let me just add to this, and then Tyson, I'll let you talk about how animals suffer differently than we do. But I say that animal suffering is not the end of the story for animals, that their suffering actually is redeemed as well. So here's another argument. It's 9 steps, so hang with me. Premise 1, if God is perfectly loving, then God desires the flourishing of all creatures he creates. 2, God is perfectly loving, 1 John 4:8. 3, therefore, God desires the flourishing of all creatures he creates. 4, if a creature is not morally responsible in a deserving of blame or punishment, then there is no justice-based barrier to its flourishing in the afterlife. 5, animals are not morally responsible in a desert sense. Unlike humans, they lack rational moral agency and libertarian freedom. 6, therefore, there is no justice-based barrier to the continued flourishing of animals in the afterlife. 7, if God desires the flourishing of a creature and nothing prevents its continued existence, then it's reasonable for us to hope that creatures will exist and flourish eternally. 8, nothing prevents God from granting continued existence to animals, including pets. 9, therefore, it's reasonable to hope that beloved animals will be granted continued life and flourishing in the new creation. And then I say, I don't just hope for it. I think it's probably true, because God is a maximally great being. So I believe that animals, at least the vertebrates, are they have souls, or their souls don't have libertarian freedom like we do. They're more like passengers along for the ride, where we are pilots, piloting our bodies, at least some of the time. But I do believe that their suffering is redeemed. I believe that I will be with my beloved dog Rondo, who I miss so much, and I believe that we will flourish together in heaven, and I think we have good reason to believe that. So ultimately, if that's true, and I've argued that it is, I don't think Alex's argument even scratches perfect being theism. Perfect being theism is standing strong. With that said, what Tyson's going to get into now is I think animals do have an added blessing on this planet. When they suffer, they don't suffer quite as bad as we do when we suffer. So Tyson, take it away.
Yeah, so what you just kind of laid out are some of the other approaches to answering the problem of animal suffering that they didn't really even touch on in the dialogue, right? And so that's important for people to understand, is that what was talked about in the dialogue was only a sliver of the conversation that can be had on this topic. And Christians especially have so many more resources to address this problem than other people, right? Because we're dealing with supernatural realities that have an impact on whether or not that suffering is, first of all, existent, and second of all, whether or not it's redeemable, right? Whether there's a purpose to it. And so we have those resources, and that's part of a broader conversation. So much literature on there that exists about all of this. So Christians are have been doing a lot of work on these topics over many, many years. And so the Christian responses can't just be dismissed out of hand so easily. Some very intelligent people have been working on this. But to this dialogue, though, Alex's position rests very heavily on this idea that animal suffering is comparable in quality to human suffering. Right, his kind of his whole case is for this particular point rests on that, because if animal suffering is like human suffering, then this hundreds of millions of years of evolution is very difficult to square with a loving God. Right? How could God? Why would he use this particular method of bringing about speciation or change, evolution, development of animals? That involves so much suffering. It just doesn't seem right for an all-loving God. The problem, though, is that he hasn't shown at all. He just kind of asserts that animals do, in fact, have similar quality of suffering to humans. But that's a huge assumption. And there's a lot of research now that, or actually Dr. Craig even says in the dialogue that this is a new area of research, a new field of study called animal consciousness. And, there's a lot of different opinions on this. It kind of reminds me of back in 1978 or 79, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, asked the famous question in an article. The title of the article was, "What is it like to be a bat?" Right? And he spends 17 pages to say, I don't know. Nobody knows what it's like to be a bat. And that is because we have certain physiological properties that are completely different from a bat. A bat has echolocation. We have absolutely no idea what it's like to have that type of echolocation. We might be able to use echoing in a certain sense using our particular ears, but that's nothing like what it is actually like to be a bat. And so the first thing to say is animal consciousness is probably much, much, much different than human consciousness. So there is an article on the Reasonable Faith website there's actually the content of the response was written by Michael Murray. Dr. Craig invited Michael Murray to write the response in this article. It is article 3, question of the week number 355, called Animal Pain Revisited. And I invite everybody to go read that article because he lays out some very, very important stuff that pertains to this particular topic. First of all, it's not even clear that a lot of animals have this consciousness of suffering.
Probably
right?
most don't seem
Probably
to
most,
have
yeah,
that.
because they just don't have the neural complexity to be aware or conscious of suffering. They might, all animals respond to what's called noxious stimuli. So noxious stimuli is just any sort of stimulus in the external world that could be detrimental to the well-being or life of the animal, right? All animals respond physiologically to noxious stimuli. But it's highly implausible that all animals consciously experience that noxious stimuli as painful, right? We call this phenomenal consciousness, right? So they might just not have the neural complexity in order to have that conscious experience.
Doesn't Dr. Craig talk about an amoeba being poked with a syringe or some kind of needle, and it responds as if we didn't know better, we'd say, "Oh, it's suffering." The way it responded, right? But clearly,
and that seems a little bit intuitive
for suffering.
That seems a little bit intuitive because I knew a farmer friend of mine that once said, "Oh, animals aren't afraid of dying; they're afraid of being chased." That's what. That's how he put it.
So one analogy for this in humans, Michael Murray talks about this in the article, is called blindsidedness, and he talks about people who they believe that they are blind. If you ask them, like, how many fingers am I holding up? They'll say, I'm blind. I can't see how many. But if you toss them a ball, they will catch it. So they can see, or they'll navigate around a room without bumping into anything. So they can see, even though they believe that they can't see, that they're blind. It's called blindsidedness. So similarly, so similarly in the animal kingdom, it may be the case that animals respond to noxious stimuli, but they don't have this conscious awareness that they are in pain. Right? Kind of like how the blindsided person does not have a conscious awareness that they have sight. So that's a very strong analogy, I think.
Blind sight, just a side note, blind sight can also help us understand aspects of the incarnation of Christ too, but that's a topic for a different YouTube video. But
tease that in there. I imagine somebody might sit there and go, wait, well, I have a dog, and when it steps on a thistle or whatever, it yelps and is clearly in pain and limping, and so it experiences pain. They might respond that way.
And Dr. Craig or nobody else has ever said that your dog doesn't experience pain. What he's arguing, this seemed to go past Alex a little bit. It seemed to me anyway. He's arguing it's not the same kind of pain. Doesn't Dr. Craig, or maybe it's Murray, that distinguishes between the third order sufferings and second order sufferings? Yeah, talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so higher order thought is what it's called. So we have an experience of pain where we can index our pain to our first person state of consciousness. We can say, I am the one that is in pain because I have a first person perspective. It's not entirely clear that non-primates or certain, lesser developed animals are capable of having that first person perspective, right? Even though they may react to stimulus in a way that we would associate with a first person perspective of pain, it's not entirely clear that animals like dogs or cats are capable of a first person perspective of pain. They just don't have the neural complexity to have that perspective. So that's a question that Michael Murray raises. He says, look, just given the science, we don't really know whether or not they do. It could be that they do, but we have no evidence to suggest that they do. And then another thing that he raises that's very interesting is, let's say that they do have a phenomenal consciousness of pain, that they are experiencing suffering very similar to us, right? Not all phenomenal consciousness of pain is associated with negative experience, right? That's also part of the assumption of Alex's case, is that the experience of pain is associated with negative feelings. But not all pain is associated with negative feelings. There are patients who have had lobotomies who they will tell the doctor, yes, I am in pain, but I just don't care about it, or I just don't have any negative feelings towards it. And so if the animals don't have any negative feelings towards the pain, even though they know they're in pain, then that undercuts the problem of suffering, right? Because it seems to deaden the fact that this suffering is supposed to be some horrendous thing that God shouldn't allow, right?
Yeah, you could even look at childbirth. Women often experience a lot of pain in childbirth, but they don't have negative feelings towards that pain. Now, of course, that's because there's a reward on the other side. You have a child, that sort of thing. But a lot of times I talked to my wife. Yeah, it was painful, but I don't have a negative correlation to that pain when I think of it.
I don't want to do it again.
Yeah, funny correlated story. My wife, our last kid, the anesthesiologist was too late, so she couldn't get an epidural. So she had to give birth, au natural, right?
Yeah.
And so she did, and it was like super quick. And then afterwards, she's just laying there, and she looks over at me. She goes, "Well, that was fun." And I was like, "What are you crazy?" She's got that flood of hormones or something, like psycho.
Yeah. Psycho.
Yeah. You heard it here first. Tyson called his wife a psycho on this show.
That's right. She knows it. Psychotic. But yeah, going back to Michael Murray and his response to all this, he includes something very interesting, this quote in the article. He says, what brain structure is important here for negative feeling pain? Is it a granular cortical layer 4 or a projection zone for from the thalamus? We don't know. But we do know when that area in humans is disrupted, then negative feeling pain sometimes disappears.
Yeah.
So if animals lack what we have in this part of the brain, then perhaps they lack this sort of pain as well. So that conclusion remains intact.
Now,
And Alex kind of hand waves that away.
well, I was going to say here. Alex says, well, hold on a second. We know that's false because there's humans who have lost that part of their brain, and we still know that they experience pain. But one thing that I would counter with, it's like, well, hold on a second. Yeah, there's amazing instances where humans have lost whole, big sections of their brain, and the brain gets rewired. I almost want to say the best explanation of that is the human soul rewiring the brain. But whatever the case might be, I mean, this goes to self-directed neuroplasticity as well. I recommend the work of Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz there, where he argues that you are not your brain, but that you can freely choose how to use your brain, and that you can even rewire your brain, and you can even restructure the physical structure of your brain. You can do it, and you are not your brain. And so anyway, here's the point to respond to Alex O'Connor when he says, no, humans have lost that section of their brain, and yet they can still experience pain. Well, I just want to say, well, yeah, humans can lose parts of their brain and it somehow gets rewired. So different parts of their brain can perform the functions that the old parts of their brain used to. I'm not an expert on that. I'd punt to JP Moreland and others.
I think we're going to be watching that clip, aren't we, Josh?
Are we? Okay.
Yeah, the next clip on Alex bringing up patient R.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Let's do it.
In Michael Murray's book that I cited before, he says that some people speculate about the development of the frontal cortex in the human brain that helps to give this first-person perspective. But in talking with Michael about this, he says this is very speculative.
It's not just
doesn't know, but there could be that.
It's not just
speculative.
Final reply.
Now, I think we're getting distracted here by.
No, we'll jump on to the next question if we can.
But the thing is, it's not just speculative. You said I could have a quick reply. It's not just speculative. It's not just speculative. I think it's incorrect. I think it's false. There are human beings who have lost their prefrontal cortex, who still have a sense of self, who report that they are in pain and know that they are in pain. We literally have. There's a famous patient called patient R, sometimes affectionately known as Roger, who lost his prefrontal cortex due to the herpes virus. They run tests on him. They put his hand in ice cold water and he tells them, I'm in pain. I'm aware that I'm in pain. Yeah. So we know for a fact it cannot be.
Okay. Well, that would suggest that Michael Murray's speculation is incorrect.
Is incorrect, and I think it is.
This question
that clip was used in the reaction video by Phil Halper, or Skydive Phil, right? He did a reaction video to this dialogue, and so he basically said, Dr. Craig admits that he was wrong, right? This is like the knockdown. Dr. Craig admits it. Really, what Dr. Craig is just saying is if this is correct, then this suggests that Michael Murray's speculation about this particular point is incorrect, right? And he wasn't familiar with that particular article that Alex brought up. So he was just conceding that if it was true, then maybe it shows that Michael Murray's thoughts on this were incorrect. But in fact, I went and looked up the article that this is based on, or the study that this is based on, and it doesn't actually show what Alex thinks it shows. So first of all, Alex says that patient R lost his prefrontal cortex due to the herpes virus. If you actually read the paper, which I have, it is called Preserved Self-Awareness Following Extensive Bilateral Brain Damage to the Insula, Anterior Cingulate, and Medial Prefrontal Cortices by a bunch of authors on this particular paper. It is available.
We'll post that in the description.
Yeah. But if you read it, what it says is that patient R didn't actually lose his entire prefrontal cortex. This is just an overstatement by Alex. What it says is that one hemisphere of the medial prefrontal cortex was basically destroyed, and that most of the other hemisphere was, but that certain areas were spared. And this is just one part of the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex. There are other parts of the prefrontal cortex that the study doesn't address. So all that to say, he just kind of overstates the case here a little bit. I think, I don't know if maybe he just got that impression from somebody else who was telling him about the study, if he read it himself, or maybe just because he was speaking extemporaneously, like he just misspoke or whatever. But the case is that in this particular study, it's not the case that patient R completely lost his prefrontal cortex. So yeah, that's one thing. Also, this particular paper and this paper is screenshotted by Phil Halper in his reaction video, which is how I tracked it down to know exactly what Alex was talking about. So this paper was written in 2000, let me check real quick, 2012, published in 2012. Michael Murray's article that I mentioned earlier on the Reasonable Faith website was published in 2014. So Michael Murray is like aware of, this content, and he's, responding. So what he notes, and I think I mentioned this already, is that even a phenomenal consciousness of pain does not entail negative feelings of suffering, right? I mentioned that before. And also that even if the self-awareness function of a human is redistributed across other areas of the brain, like Tim, you were saying, like neuroplasticity, we can redistribute functionality across different regions of the brain, especially if they're damaged. So even if that self-awareness of pain was redistributed to other areas in patient R that Alex is referring to, this doesn't show that other animals with those other areas would have the same capacity for higher order thought that is necessary for that first person awareness of suffering, right? Perhaps you would have to have the human-like complexity to begin with to have the first person awareness of pain in order to be redistributed to those other areas. So Alex has not at all shown that just because you have these other areas of the brain, that therefore you can still have the first person awareness of suffering like humans do.
It's really hard to, no matter what we talk about with the brain structure here and what parts of the brain are missing or not missing. I pay attention to animals. I'm an animal lover. I talk about my dog Rondo all the time and how sad it was when he died a year ago or so. And now I have another puppy named Daisy and just love her so much. And I just, but I'm constantly watching and evaluating my animals and other animals. And it's really hard for me to believe that my animals could even form the thought, I am Rondo, and then, so then if you can't do that, then there does seem to be something different about I am in pain. And when you think about what makes our pain so bad, it's not just that, when we go through immense pain and suffering, it's often connected to the idea that it's somehow going to thwart our plans and what we had planned for us and for our futures and things like that. That's when it really gets bad. That when the things that we were hoping for now, because we've experienced this accident or got into a wreck or whatever, now I'm not going to be able to do these things. That's when it gets even worse. So look, I'm not discounting the fact that animals suffer and that animals experience pain. I'm saying they don't experience it to the levels that humans do. Humans experience pain and suffering in a way that animals don't, in a way that is much worse for us at times. Think about what it's like to be hurt from, morally, when a friend betrays you or something like that. It's often worse than if a friend was going to punch you. The emotional pain is worse than the physical pain. And I just think that there's kinds of sufferings and afflictions that humans go through that an animal could never go through and that they don't experience. So even if they don't, even if we're just completely on a different subject from how the brain is structured. But what would you guys add to that?
Well, to kind of put a bow on it, I would say that this then becomes a point in Christian theism's favor, because it is the only religion in which the omnibenevolent God chose to come and experience that sort of pain and suffering in a way that most of us could never imagine. I mean, you talk about betrayal of a friend. Imagine the affectionate kiss of a friend to turn you into the hands of your enemies so that you could be slaughtered for the world to see, be blamed for all of the ills of the Jewish elites, and then go to your death on an execution device called a cross. So in that realm, once you reason it that way, then Christian theism seems to make the only sense, because then Jesus not only experienced the type of pain that animals experience, of course he did, but he experiences far and beyond any of the pain that even humans experience. Rejection of the very people that you created, that have rejected you and wanted to kill you. And so he experiences that pain even now as people reject him. I think God experiences the pain of being rejected by the creation that he so lovingly longs for. And far from being an imperfection, I think this adds but you get what I'm saying, adds to the case, not adds to perfections, but adds to the case that the Christian God is the omniperfect God. So let's do one more thought from each of us on that realm, and then we'll tie a bow on this and close out.
Let's give Tyson the last word. So I'll just say, again, I really appreciate the objection that Alex O'Connor raised. I saw a lot of Christians online just dismissing it, like, oh, this is just emotional, this shouldn't be taken seriously. And my response was, no, this should be taken seriously. There's a logical argument behind this objection. I tried to steel man it. If I didn't do so properly, I'd love to be corrected by Alex or anybody else. But with that said, if I did understand his objection correctly, I don't think it passes, because if Christianity is true, and if the ontological argument passes, and I think both are, I think it does pass. I think Christianity is true. I think that Jesus revealed in Scripture is a maximally great being, and if that's the case, then he would not allow gratuitous pain, evil, and suffering. I think it all plays a role in the redemption of humans and even animals. And that's why, because I'm a Christian, I have a reasonable hope that all animals do exist for eternity in a perfect suffering-free state of affairs. I do look around and say I do kind of have a Narnia view of heaven, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, and then just to kind of wrap up here, again, I thought Dr. Craig did a great job. All of the responses that he gave were so incisive, and all of the resources and thoughts we brought up here in this talk today just go to show that the arguments that Alex brought forward and the objections that he brought forward don't really do anything to the case for Christianity. I think we're still on very solid ground as far as having reasons for believing that God exists. They didn't even talk about Jesus at all, or the resurrection. Right. So that wasn't even touched. But also, just talking about the objection from animal suffering, how there are so many different aspects of this that we can point to that say, we have good responses to this. I think that just goes to show how much work has been done in Christian scholarship, that today we just have an embarrassment of riches as far as that goes. And I think we're very privileged to be living in a time with so many great Christian academics. I think it is really a golden age. The other thing too is that after this dialogue, Dr. Craig, he got home, is still, he was recovering at home with Jan from this sickness that he had, and he wrote a newsletter. And in the newsletter that went out through Reasonable Faith, he said that this dialogue, he believed, shattered the veneer that Alex puts forward of being a non-resistant non-believer.
Yeah, that's right.
And Alex does present himself that way. He's, very consistent in trying to say, I'm willing to look at the evidence. I'm willing to be corrected. I want to look at all the arguments and things like that. But it seems more and more like he's so willing to bite the absurd and implausible bullets that it's less and less convincing that he is non-resistant.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate because, obviously he knows that if he is resistant, that has some major implications for, one of the arguments he puts forward from divine hiddenness, right? And the whole Schellenberg thing.
Which, by the way, we get into all that here too.
Yeah. So, aside from how things got in the Q&A between him and either the moderator or the guy asking questions in the balcony or whatever, it just seems more and more like the way that Alex is being pressed on these issues, and he doesn't seem to be going that much more deeply into the scholarship and what Christian scholars have actually been saying on these things. I don't know if he just doesn't have the time for that, or if he's just unwilling. But the fact that he's getting up in front of these large audiences and continuing to, seem to accept more and more absurd premises and conclusions, it just doesn't look good. I would love to see him take more seriously the top tier academic literature that Christians have provided.
Yeah, and even if he wasn't, even if he was maybe a non-resistant non-believer before, maybe that could be the case. But it could also be the case that once you build a platform and a certain personality and a certain following, and I'm not saying he's doing it on purpose or intentionally. There's a web of motivations there, right? That it can become resistance even if you think you're not resistant.
The sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Where you've sunk so much time and energy into something that you're less likely to have motivation to let it go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tyson, thanks for joining us. Give Dr. Craig our regards and pray that he's continuing to recover. Hopefully people watched this and found it helpful. I hope Alex watched this, and we would love to have a dialogue with you. I'm sure Tyson would love to have a dialogue with you as well. We'd all love to just have a great chat about animal suffering, about divine hiddenness, all that sort of stuff. So, and maybe you're an Alex fan, you stumbled on this channel and you've got some things, hey, post them below and we could interact with them. So comment, make sure you like this video, share it, subscribe, all those sorts of things. Thank you for your time. Hopefully this was edifying. Once again, thanks Tyson for joining us. And as we say here at FreeThinking Ministries,
stay reasonable.
Stay reasonable.